All right, so let me start over, and let me start by welcoming you, and my apologies for our technical difficulties here. And my thanks to the press for making this possible. And my thanks particularly to the educators and students who have shared their stories with me over the years. Without them, this book would not have happened. And let me also add that books don't write themselves. And many of the people here listening have helped with that book. And so I want you to know that in some sense, this is your book. Now, the book was written before the pandemic and certainly had relevance then. But with the pandemic and with the racial tensions and with the anniversary of the slavery freedom, Juneteenth, the book becomes all the more important. And in a sad way, it becomes a book for this moment, a book for our time. And the book was written for students, not for them necessarily to read, but for them so that they can do more than just survive, so they can thrive. And it was meant for students, is meant for students who are young and older, who are rich and poor, who are white and black and brown, who are of any gender, who are homeless or have homes, who have food or don't have food. As long as a student is enrolled in a school, this book relates to their ability not just to survive, but to thrive. And that being the goal of this book, I want to say that I get that not everyone will agree with all the strategies that are in the book. I understand that. And I know very well that you get into the Baseball Hall of Fame just batting .350. But my hope is that those who read this book ask new questions, think about issues from a trauma perspective, try new initiatives, because at the end of the day, success for all our students is what we so desperately need. Now, I also want to point out that some people have thought trauma is just a trend. And if you thought that pre-pandemic, perhaps there might be some rationale that you could give. But certainly now, after the pandemic and after the racial tensions, it's near to impossible to argue that trauma hasn't happened to many, many of our students. And so I hope this book will help all of you when you work with students to help them navigate a pathway forward, because we all need them to do that. And in that context, let me just share that there was an article today in the Boston Globe about racism at Boston's elite private schools, Boston area. And one of the students, and I want to quote that student, responded to the racial experiences he had had this way. And it's a perfect segue to introducing the panel and this book and the concept of Gen T. Here's what he said. I had too many negative, racially charged experiences to count. It really damaged me. I am in college now and am still unlearning the trauma that resulted from my time at high school. Now, that message about processing the trauma that happened to you in school is in addition to all the trauma that students bring with them to school and that they experience as a result of the outside world, their family world, pandemics, racial tensions. Trauma, sadly, abounds. And it's for that reason that the book names this generation of students, the generation enrolled in schools from 2001 forward, as Generation T, with the T standing for trauma. But instead of using the word trauma, which alienates some people, I've named this generation Gen T or Generation T. And I hope it's a nomenclature that becomes a way of people thinking about and remembering to put on their trauma lens and think about that with respect to students. And before I introduce the panel, one word about the gifts. In addition to free books, the other 10 winners will get a trauma-responsive toolbox. And the point of this toolbox, which contains tools to help you navigate trauma, can be used by the person who gets it, or they can give it to someone who could use it, or they could replicate it for others. But I want to just focus on, you see that little stone hope, which is in that toolbox? I want to tell a little story about Pandora, who opened her box. And when she opened her box, all the evil spirits came out of Pandora's box. But there is one thing that never came out of Pandora's box, and that was hope. And the last few chapters of the book deal with hope, because at the end of the day, I hold out hope that we will become more trauma responsive and that we will be able to help all of our students. So with that, let me introduce the panel. The panel covers each segment of the educational system. So there's someone from the elementary segment, someone from the college segment, and someone from the adult education segment. So I'm going to introduce them in that order, and then I'll introduce the moderator. So first we have Allyson Hoffman, who is the media director and head librarian at the Molly Stark Elementary School in Vermont. That is a school that is 100% free and reduced lunch. It is a school where I've been an artist in residence, reading my children's books and working with the students there for 4 years. And it's a school that is filled with students who have been traumatized. Next, we have Gill Hunter, who is at Eastern Kentucky University, EKU, where he is a professor of English, but he is also the executive director of their initiative on retention and graduation. So first of all, it's remarkable they have that position. And second of all, this is someone who not only understands students, which he does, but he understands faculty and pathways to get faculty to be more responsive to the students that they serve. And the last panelist is Marie Cini, who was the provost at the University of Maryland College, and then she was the CEO of Kale, and now she is the Chief Strategy Officer for Ed2Work, and she is one of the nation's leading experts on adult education and how to facilitate adults learning, adults who have stopped out or dropped out or come back to school. And she is really an extraordinary educator and also a key person in understanding the pipeline between education and the workplace. Which gets me to our moderator, Brian Ellerbeck. This book would not have been written without Brian. Brian asks an author the very best questions an author could ever hope for. He asks the questions that show the soft spots in your argument. And while he's asking these questions, these very hard questions, he's also supportive of the author and the author's voice. And I just have to say that everyone should be so fortunate to have an editor like Brian. And so with that, I look forward to learning from the panel, and I turn it over to Brian.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here. I'm delighted to share in the book launch. This is a moment for celebration in the midst of many reasons not to celebrate. The world keeps giving us new reasons to need to pay attention to your book. You know, one of them that you had alluded to earlier, Karen, is Juneteenth. And so this book launch occurs only a few days after the occurrence of Juneteenth. And perhaps I can turn to the panelists to have them speak to ways in which your book and the insights contained in your book, while you're not explicitly focused on racial tensions per se in the book, trauma-responsive strategies and attentiveness to trauma and understanding of trauma is something that benefits us across experiences of tension, of trauma. Gill, maybe I can start with you to have you speak to the ways in which this book might help address issues of racial tension on campus.
Sure, yeah. Thank you very much, Brian. I appreciate it. And I appreciate the chance to be here with everybody today. It's a really good question, I think. And I'm drawn to what Karen talks about in terms of micro solutions and macro solutions. And something that I've heard a lot about the last couple of days, the last couple of weeks, that we didn't hear a lot about before, at least, from a position of privilege, is this idea of systemic racism, not individualized racism, but systemic. And I think that what Karen talks about in her book is the need for solutions that are systemic as well. So, for example, an individual classroom teacher can address an individual student's situation of trauma, but we gain a lot more leverage when we have an entire school or an entire school system that really kind of recognizes and names trauma and works to make their school and indeed their entire community a safe place for students who are unable to kind of identify their needs on their own. So I think that same kind of parallel works in the conversation that I've been hearing in the national news the last couple of weeks.
Sure, thank you. I have another question, and I want to address this question to Marie. Marie, there's one among the big ideas that are contained in the book is an idea that emerges right at the outset of the book. On page 8, Karen says, in the educational sector, the onus is on the educators and their organizations for ameliorating trauma, not the students. Why do you think that might be true?
Well, I think it is true because especially, so, I've spent my career working with adult students. They often come to the classroom and are not even aware. They might not even have the label. They might not know what it means to have gone through trauma. It's just their life. And if they're having a difficult time in education, they tend to self-blame, or, oh, see, I just can't do this, or I don't have an attention span. We really have to be that bigger group that can say, okay, you've had these difficulties in your life. We're not going to make it even harder for you. And unfortunately, especially I love Allyson's stories about, the safe space in the library. Especially for adults, we tend to think of education as education and not any of the affective. It's like, you're getting your degree, okay, fine. We have to think about all the other things that impact students in the classroom, virtual or otherwise.
Thank you, Marie. I have a question now for Allyson. Allyson, I'm going to read another passage from the book, which occurs on page 73 in the book, and it's a passage in which Karen is examining vicarious trauma, that is, the trauma experienced by educators from the experience of having to deal with trauma in their midst. And on page 73, I quote, she says, "I think when we suffer from vicarious trauma, we lock the good things in some mental cabinet and the lock is strong. The goal is to get that cabinet unlocked and the door open so we can return to our work and our capacity to care. When educators get vicarious trauma, it is truly time to pause and reset." And while undoubtedly that is the case, I have a question. Is that work of repairing from vicarious trauma a responsibility of individual educators alone? Or do you think that there's a role for the institution as well in helping educators come to terms with it?
So no, I don't think Oh, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. No, it's not the individual educator's responsibility alone. We need to make those micro and macro changes that Karen suggests in her book, not only for our learners, our students, but for our teachers as well. All faculty and staff need to be properly trained.
Thank you. Thank you. I have a question for each of the panelists. And Karen, when you cut out a little while ago, and then we all collectively cut out a little while ago, I had asked the panelists to connect personal experiences that they may have had in their role working with students in trauma, and then if there were any strategies that are employed in the book that connected to that experience. And we had heard Allyson's story. Thank you, Allyson. I'm wondering if I could turn to Gill and then to Marie to hear your experiences.
Sure, I'd be happy to share one experience that's resonated with me since I read the book. I can't draw from my experience at EKU necessarily, because there's a student that I had when I was teaching high school named Terry. And I keep thinking about Terry because I have to confess I did not give Terry what he needed in the moment. I, in retrospect, can see that Terry was a victim of some trauma, probably some long-term ongoing trauma. And that manifested itself in his behavior in a wide range of ways that mostly just got under my skin. I wasn't tolerant, I wasn't patient, mostly because I came from a place of a lack of understanding. And I thought by removing him from the classroom, by imposing some discipline, that I was benefiting the rest of the students in the class. And this was a number of years ago, but I wish that I had had the training to be responsive to trauma, not even just aware, but responsive, because I think I would have benefited Terry and probably a lot of other students whose trauma was manifesting itself in a wide range of ways that I simply wasn't familiar with.
Yeah, I just a follow-up question, if I may. Did you recognize that student's behavior as the result of trauma?
No, I can admit I did not. Not that individual student, and probably not many of my students at the time, unless someone like a guidance counselor came down and said, I can't share much information, but this student is a victim of trauma. That would have been the only marker I had, because we didn't really have a vocabulary for it until the last few years, which is why a book like this is essential.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Thank you. Marie, do you have any insights?
Well, it's been a while since I've taught in a classroom. I've been an administrator for a while now, but reading the book, and I shared this with Karen, looking back, I thought of so many behaviors that I had to wonder if, in fact, they were trauma related. So when you think about students that sort of disappear from class, or I remember one student that just sort of sat in the back and, very guarded and morose. And it's so easy as a faculty member to just think, well, what's wrong with that student, or to blame the student, and not really think about these are symptoms of something else going on. And again, no one, especially in college, you are not trained to teach, let alone to be responsive to students who have any kind of condition like a traumatic situation.
Thank you. Thank you. I want to quote another quote from the book, which leads to another question. And this occurs on page 50 of the book. Karen says, children should not, and this is in reference to engaging in trauma-sensitive responsiveness. She says, children should not be asked when they fight, flee, or freeze what is wrong with them, because they did nothing wrong. Instead, they should be asked what happened to them. My question is, for those occasions where we're asking the wrong question, where we're maintaining insensitivity to trauma-influenced behavior, how that might affect students. Allyson, can you speak to that?
Well, especially after reading Karen's book, I feel that it can trigger former experiences and will not help the child succeed in any way, shape, or form. I believe in an elementary school, especially, there should be books available for children about the feelings, diversity, mindfulness, and we are working on that in the classroom libraries and in the library media center itself. And starting next year, I would like to come back to the next book and talk about this. We're starting to implement a program called Second Step, and it's rooted in social emotional learning that will help transform schools into supportive, successful learning environments uniquely equipped to encourage children to thrive. So, and I want to get this book in the hands of all of our faculty and staff, so they will understand the effect from the behavior, how that would affect a learner if they were insensitive to the responses.
Thank you, Allyson. Another big idea that appears in the book a little bit later on in the book, where Karen talks about what she refers to as the ideal trauma-responsive school, and she describes a school. You go into a good deal of detail about the design of the school and how that design is related to ways for educators to prepare settings that help ameliorate trauma, anticipate needs, and then respond to needs. And one of the features of that trauma-responsive school is an open classroom space. Now, that open classroom space and the design of the school can look somewhat different from a lot of schools that we currently have. In fact, probably look a lot different from most schools that we currently have. And school design and school architecture is a conversation had not only by those who are looking at trauma-responsive situations, but also by a much different audience, and that is individuals who are focused on issues of security. So one of the things that is one of the preeminent triggers for trauma is our school shootings, as we know, and events within a school where students are and staff and communities are terrorized. And the discussion around design, school design in these settings looks a lot different. How do we, I'm gonna raise the question to each of you. We can start with Gill on this one, but how do we navigate that tension between the need for security on the one hand and the need for trauma responsiveness on the other hand within the physical space that we inhabit?
It's a phenomenal question, and I've really struggled in thinking about an answer. You posed this question to us a couple of days ago, and I really wrestled with it, because the first thing that a middle school principal tells parents is that they will keep their children safe. The first thing a high school principal tells parents is our number one job is to keep your students safe, and then we're going to educate them. And when a student moves to a university campus, we try to assure their parents that they're going to be safe. Those are aspirational in terms of physical safety. But what we are only now starting to pay attention to is the psychological safety of a student. And those two things, as you kind of indicate, are at odds with each other sometimes. We may ensure a student's physical safety, but one way we do that is by putting them through metal detectors as they enter the school building. And I don't know that that helps them with their psychological feelings of safety. Then we bring them to a university campus, and there's safety in a residence hall, perhaps, because they have to swipe in and outsiders don't get access. But they also have lots of free time, and 18, 19, 20-year-olds find their own entertainment, and that comes with risk. And so we say we're going to keep them safe, but we can't promise that. And it's a struggle. And then we have individual faculty members that want to create a sense of safety in their classroom, and that student's in that space for 2.5 hours out of the week. And so the word I used was aspirational. And I think that's the right word on a college campus, is that we want to help students feel safe, secure, so that they can kind of clear away some clutter in their life and focus on what we think matters most. But it is so often for students still an empty promise. And all of that's to say, I'll quit after this, but all of that's to say, that's the best answer we have before a pandemic hits and we send students home and we say, don't infect your grandparents with this horrible virus, you know, and we can't tell you if you've got it or not. And so we've just kind of complicated all of this and said, and while you're home, make sure you can get online for 30 hours a week and do all of this work that is going to stress you out even more. So it's not been easy. It's not been easy, I'll say that.
Terribly difficult. Thank you. Gil, that was great. Thank you. Marie, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I've been thinking, as I've been thinking about this webinar, just what a traumatizing society we live in. We try to separate this out, that, you know, we need to be safe at school, well, we need to be safe everywhere, but we see more and more how traumatic it is for large groups of people just to live. I mean, I again, work with adult students. We don't design classrooms for them necessarily. A lot of them learn online. Many of them who are low income have a very difficult life. And there's, you know, traumatic situations that the rest of us aren't facing every day. We know that there are a lot of college students of all ages that are homeless or insecure with where they live or have food insecurity. So I'm not sure I'm adding to any kind of solution as much as I'm pointing out that we have a society that is just, it creates these conditions that it makes it very difficult. And to try to say that we can somehow solve it in a high school or in a elementary school, it's a good start, but my gosh, the bigger world is trauma inducing.
Thank you. Allyson, do you have something to add?
I was just talking to Karen yesterday, and right now is the time to come together. Like, I'm on a leadership team committee. So when you talk about creating and designing these spaces within the school, let's do that now. For if they come back in the fall, let's start that now as a team. If it's a small team, which we have about 8, so let's start creating that. Let's start planning that and how that's going to change when they come back in the fall. I think it's so important right now. And a lot of those strategies you will read in Karen's book of how to do that.
Thank you. Thank you. My last question before I turn it over to our audience for their questions, thank you for waiting and for listening, is another one of Karen's big ideas, I think is really one of the key insights of the book. And that is that Karen points out that the more customary approaches to dealing with trauma silo the issue. So by that, we have elementary educators examine trauma in the elementary school, and middle school educators in the middle school, and high school educators in high school, and college level and college, and post-secondary, college, and college into career, into their silo. Yet the experience of trauma follows in many cases from birth. And it is not, the experience of trauma is not siloed, yet a response to trauma is siloed. How can we think about, or how might we think about breaking that siloed approach when it comes to an issue quite so tremendously important and consequential as dealing with trauma? How might we think institutionally of responding to things in an unsiloed fashion? Marie, I want to start with you on this. Any ideas come to mind for you?
I have 2. One is, let's actually solve the problem so there's less trauma going on. I mean, look, I realize everybody can say, well, that's ridiculous. You can't solve all those problems. But we're seeing this now with the social unrest. Like, this is why people want to defund the police, because the argument is not that, you know, we don't need police, but we probably need to take some of that money and put it into programs that help those individuals in ways that they then might not need to call the police later, or they won't get involved with police. In a similar fashion, I just think we're at this point in our society where we really have to rethink communities. I've been thinking a lot about communities of all kinds. How do we structure communities that are healthier and better for people, and that help all of us take care of, we want fewer kids who are facing that trauma. I think that to think about how do we cross all of those different silos is so daunting, because again, and I keep bringing this up, the post-secondary system is very different. You can be quite nurturing in a K through 12 setting if you have the right schools and the right leaders. And then you get to college, and while we might pay some lip service to it, for the most part in colleges, you're kind of on your own. And, you know, you sink or swim. And if you're an adult, believe me, it's even more so. There's this belief that adults have it all together. They just haven't finished for whatever reason. So there you go, just take the classes. In fact, if you think about it, and I'm not being simplistic, or I'm not trying to be, the longer you live, if you've had trauma along the way, the more you've experienced that and re-experienced that. So it actually can get worse. And so, you know, I think we need to actually start investing in ways that we're not traumatizing people as much, or allowing people to be traumatized without early treatment. And we need to start talking about it more. And then I'll let someone else go, but as I was reading the book, my brain kept flipping to, well, this is only a few people. This can't be as many people as Karen Rice. It's like my own brain wouldn't allow me to see this as, you know, it's ubiquitous, and I've experienced my own as well. You sort of have to do that if you read this book seriously. Think about your own traumatic experiences.
Sure, thank you. Allyson, I have a question for you, kind of tangential to this. In your school district, is there any opportunity to connect to folks outside the elementary school around something like this?
As a district, we do have a committee that is on a team to look at traumatic situations, but we need to, as a whole, I mean, this has to be the entire faculty and staff, and it needs to go throughout the entire district. We're getting there. I think we're trying to get there. Hopefully we're going to bring Karen on board. I keep pushing for it. So, but we do need that consistency, you know, that goes, you know, from elementary and all of the schools. We have about 6 elementary schools, and then all these kids are going to be together in middle school. So we need to be consistent in all these areas, and then they're going to move on up to the high school, all of them together. So we need a plan. We need to work on that, and hopefully that's coming. And you know, another thing, going back to Karen's book, I would have been one of those 600 professionals in the room that didn't raise their hand when Karen asked if they had heard of the ACE study. So I feel that school administrators, the teachers, the counselors, and all of the schools in the entire district need to be aware of assessment tools such as that, and self-assess. Karen also states that if educators read the questions and understand that they themselves have experienced adverse childhood events, this could shift how we view ourselves and the learners, and this would be a great start.
Sure. Thank you. So thank you. I'm going to now turn to our audience and invite questions. There's 2 questions that have come in already, and I invite more questions from the audience. And I'm going to start with a question that has popped in from Robin Moreland. And Robin says, I haven't read the new book yet, but the conversation seems like a lot of dynamics other professionals should be helping guide. Now the question just popped away. This is too bad.
Brian, go to the answered tab.
Yes,
My apologies. That was premature.
okay, thank you. And it says, I'd love to hear from Dr. Gross regarding the roles she thinks mental health, social workers, and law enforcement play in the school setting.
All right, I'll give it a try. Can you hear me?
Yes.
So it's a very, very good question. And so in addition to thinking across silos within education, and I think one pathway to doing that, by the way, is by completely changing how we do professional development, which is deeply siloed. So institutions are siloed within themselves, then professional development is siloed. So we could make a lot of change by reversing how we do professional development. But it's interdisciplinary in another way, which is that the ultimate solutions here are not just in the hands of educators. Although the focus of this book is education, you need lots of other disciplines to participate and share in this approach. And that includes healthcare professionals, including pediatricians and obstetricians. It includes social workers. It includes school counselors. It includes, importantly, school nurses, who often are the first ones who would have an opportunity to see trauma and participate and think about how to help that child. The kid who comes in with the stomach ache, that may be trauma, or the kid who doesn't come to school at all may be because of trauma. And then in addition to all of that, I think you have to involve the community, and that includes religious leaders and other members of the community, because if you do this in a sort of patchwork way, it will never be systemic and it will never be sustainable. And so you really have to have an siloed and interdisciplinary approach to addressing trauma. And by the way, just one more thought on this. Kids carry trauma like an invisible backpack or an invisible suitcase. And I think it was Marie who pointed out, once you have that suitcase, you carry it with you on a go-forward basis. And you carry it into middle school and into high school and into college and into your workplace. So it's not like somehow this all disappears. Trauma doesn't get reversed, it gets ameliorated.
Thank you. Thank you, Karen. It reminds me, Karen, your remark reminds me of a manifestation of traumatic experience for college students. I don't know what the statistic is, but the incidence of college students who have housing insecurity and food insecurity and have to carry that weight around over and above all the other stressors that they may have in their lives. So that's, again, one of many such kind of manifestations of trauma that are maintained at this point at the college level.
Yeah.
Okay. Another question. This from Martha Cantor. She asks, what is the most important action steps universities and community colleges can take to collaborate with early learning, K-12, and social service professionals to embed an intergenerational approach to help parents and students reduce trauma simultaneously in a whole family approach? Talk about a mouthful. That's a great question. That is telescopes. So I'm gonna open that up to the panel and see if one of you or all of you could respond to that.
Well, I can probably get a start to it, but then I'll be grateful for the others to join in because that's a daunting proposition. There is no doubt whatsoever. And I think that it probably begins in our education system with pre-service teachers. So what our education of future teachers looks like, because we we do focus a lot on content. And like, as I'm preparing an English teaching major, we focus a lot on English teaching content, but then they get into the classroom and the content often pales in comparison to the student needs that are right in front of them. And I've heard both Allyson and Marie today talk about community. And to me, that's where the difference is going to be made. When we start educating students to become teachers, to become social workers, to see themselves as part of a system, to know that they are not alone, that they are not going to, the days of walking into their classroom and shutting the door and teaching the students in their room, those days are over. And if we are not the village that it's going to take to raise these students, then we are not going to help them overcome the things that have beset them. We talk about FERPA all the time on a college campus. And you know, the one caveat to FERPA is you're allowed to talk about students you share if you share their educational interest. Well, the fact is that the community shares the educational interest of every single student in a high school, in a middle school, in an elementary school, and on a college campus. We need to be invested in the success of these students. And that begins with, as Marie kind of said, let's quit doing the things that traumatize these students. Let's try to eliminate trauma. But then when we know that students are traumatized, let's start to work together. Let's really collaborate with that focus that we're going to give students the tools that are going to help them overcome.
Thank you. I just a kind of follow up to everyone. So it bespeaks the need for policy solutions as well, I imagine.
So let me try a stab at the very good question too. I believe changing teacher education is obviously a necessity. In fact, trauma is often not taught, and certainly not taught as a separate course in many schools of education. But I want to back up the train a little bit here and ask the question, if you don't know what trauma is, and if you don't know what its symptomology is, and if you don't know what its impact is on individuals as they mature, then surely you might not think it's important enough to address. And so within the architecture of the book, it talks about naming trauma, taming trauma, and then framing trauma so that we know it's an important topic that needs to be addressed. And so for me, that's a sort of precursor to all this. Most people, or many people, couldn't define trauma other than perhaps physical trauma. And if we want to achieve some of the sort of systemic approaches, we have to start by understanding what it is, figuring out how to identify it, then figuring out how to ameliorate it, but also stressing its importance. Put it in a frame. That's why the name Gen T. We have to start talking through a trauma lens, and then we have to not just talk, we have to act through that trauma lens.
Common language. Common language.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Thank you. Thank you. Another question that came in that is a good follow-up to what you just said, and a good concrete question. And Karen, I think you're a very good person to answer this question. Pat Neal raised this question. What are some of the first things educators can do when students return to school in the fall, especially in the DC area?
So I actually have written about that both in the book and outside the book, because we know that when students return, they will have experienced trauma, separation, instability, uncertainty, fear. And what trauma takes away are the 5 S's. And I want to say that because if you can put them back when students come back, that's hugely helpful. So trauma takes away stability, it takes away structure, it takes away safety, it takes away subtlety, namely personalization, and it takes away someone other than your family to whom you're close. So my suggestion, because my guess is that most students coming back to school at every level will not be ready to engage in immediate learning. It's not like you're going to just like open the book and say like, where were we before we were so rudely interrupted here? I think you have to start with exercises that that navigate the autonomic nervous system. And there are a number of strategies that can do that. But if you don't do that, Maslow had it right. If you don't take care of basic needs, you can't get to higher learning of any sort. So I think the first thing all educators have to do is institute strategies, trauma-responsive strategies to deal with the autonomic nervous system. And I could go into great detail as to what those look like, but those are key. And using your senses is one way, and using that trauma-responsive toolbox with all of the tools in there is a way to do it. So here's one strategy really quickly. If kids can't get their autonomic nervous system under control, they can't learn. So for teachers who say, oh my goodness, I'm not going to get enough content done, it doesn't matter, because if you can't get them on the same page, they're not going to learn anyway. So here's a strategy. It has to do with balance. Have students stand up and then stand on one leg, their dominant leg, and then switch over to their non-dominant leg. And then have them do that for like 30 seconds. For some students, that's harder than others. And then have them do it with their eyes closed. And what you're doing when you do those 3 little exercises is you're shifting their brain, you're altering the pathway, you're taking them from where they are to a new place. And actually, by the way, it's not so easy to do with your eyes closed. And what underneath it is happening is you're helping them find their center so they can start to learn again.
Thank you, Karen. I have another question. The question is, I'm a teacher at a juvenile hall. This book is so important to understanding the acting out of the students. I wondered, why is it that reading or studying new skills, etc., can really bring up the self-doubt and negative self-talk of folks who've had trauma? Is there any way to make reading, writing essays, and other academic endeavors less triggering for students with high ACEs scores? Karen, perhaps that's another good question for you.
Well, so the question raises the really important issue of triggering and re-triggering. So for lots of students, asking them to do certain things triggers them and triggers their prior trauma. So that's a very important recognition. And that means that not all students experience trauma the same way. I think, Brian, in a note to me at one point, you said trauma seems like a fingerprint. Everybody's got their own sort of personalized version of it, and that's a really good way of thinking about it. I think one way, and I get that there are many people who don't agree with this, but I do think trigger warnings help. I do think saying to students, this may be difficult for some of you. I also think forcing students to do assignments that just don't feel right now doesn't make any sense, because you're not going to get something helpful out of them or from them. I think one way that I think about is to give students blocks, like a red block and a green block, and maybe a yellow block. A red block means I can't do this today. A green block means, okay, I'm willing to try. And a yellow is I'm sort of ambivalent about the whole thing. And if a child on a particular day or adult student has that issue and shows the red block, then don't force them. Give them something else to do, something they can do. Build off a positive. And then if the red block's there for too many days, of course you have to address it. But my point is, forcing students to do something, getting them to act out, isn't the right way. It's to flip it around, listen to where they're coming from, acknowledge that they maybe can't do it on a given day, and then build off their positives. And by the way, I was working with a group where students work in addition to all the other things they do. They work in in an environment where they go through shifts and do different functions within a business. And they pointed out that not every day every student wants to do everything they're supposed to do in their shift. And I said, so they don't do it on a particular day. And like they looked at me like, what? And I go, well, you're forcing them. Have them sit there and do something else that day. We so believe in learning that we forget that you need receptivity to learning for it to work.
Thank you, Karen. Another comment question. Thank you for all the panelists of sharing your experience. From a macro level, we can look at public health approach that includes all community sectors. Would love to see it done at a community level as a demonstration.
So can I comment on that for a minute? I've always thought that the state of Vermont could be a beta site for something like this, because it's a state with 680,000 people. It's a state with manageable systems. So I think the idea is right. We should try this systemic approach in a state or in a location that has the components there to do it, and then replicate it and scale it. But let me point something out. You don't replicate and scale the exact thing everywhere, right? Different communities have different cultures and different norms and different approaches. What you need is the same values have to work in all of the systems wherever they're located.
Thank you, Karen. Another question that came in. I'm a psychologist specializing in trauma treatment from Michigan, and we've had 2 serial sexual assault incidents at the university level. One for Michigan State with Larry Nassar against females, and another with Robert Anderson at the University of Michigan against males. There's a lack of case finding from the domestic violence and sexual assault agencies in my area for male survivors of sexual assault. Any suggestions for how to make these programs more inclusive?
Well, Gill and Marie may have thoughts on that, and then I can chime in.
I can defer to Marie if she has a thought. I mean, that's a vexing question for sure. And I think Michigan State and University of Michigan have struggled with that. But Marie, I'll let you lead if you want. I'm not trying to put you on the spot.
No, that's okay. It really isn't my area of expertise, so I'm not going to go there. Sorry.
All right, I'll give it a try. I think the reality is that we haven't, not just in Michigan, as a society, recognized the price that's paid for the sexual trauma that has occurred, that in many cases has gone unnoticed for years and years and years. And I think for me, one of the tragedies of it is that it sometimes takes another event to raise the awareness of what's happened to other people before the current survivors have voiced their story. So here's one strategy that may not be popular, but I think when survivors of trauma use their voice when they speak, there's power in that voice. And I think part of the problem is finding your voice and having people around you who will help you find your voice. Because as much as agencies could or could not step up, survivors of all sorts of abuse can benefit from speaking up and out. There's a value to protest, peaceful protest, even angry protest. And so there's a book that may be of interest. There's a woman who was sexually assaulted and practically left for dead by a swimmer at Stanford. And she gave a statement anonymously at his sentencing. And we could debate how weak the sentence was, but fast forward, she wrote a book in which she disclosed her name. And one of the reasons she did that, she said, is I have to own and share what happened to me. So I think in Michigan, I think people have to speak up and out and loudly about what's happened. And I think the more people who speak up and out, the more likely we are to get people to pay attention to the gravity of the situation.
Thank you, Karen. Nuts and bolts question for Karen. Describe Generation T again, please.
Sure. Gen T is Generation T. Okay, let me back up. We have a history of naming generations, and we do it in the United States. We also do it in other nations. And the idea of naming a generation is that you find homogeneous features within members of that generation. Now, I've had a lot of trouble with naming of generations because it tends to be, in a sense, leaving out many people in that homogenization process. But in any event, we have the baby boomers, we have Gen Z, we have the silent generation, and we have names for all of them. So the issue came up, what do we name the current generation, the one that is after Gen Z? And some people have said, well, let's just restart the alphabet and call them Gen Alpha or Alpha Gen. And I thought, well, wait a minute here. The way we define a generation historically is from birth forward 20 years. That's a generation, give or take. And so if you look at Beloit College, which for many years, I think they handed it off to Marist, used to do a survey and define the generation of college students at any given point in time. I think that approach is too narrow and misses what a generation really is. And for me, Gen T is the generation that is in our educational system starting in 2001 with the fall of the Twin Towers and the attack on the Pentagon and the plane crash in Pennsylvania. That's the start of really when our awareness of and life changed. And so from anyone who's a student from 2001 forward is a member of Gen T.
Thank you, Karen. Here's one, Karen, I think you'll like in particular. Will there be an audiobook version narrated by the author herself? Karen, very articulate, has a lovely voice, and I would enjoy being able to listen to her speak about these topics, which she is very passionate about. What do you
well, that sounds like one of my former students or something. Well, I've explored doing it, not with my voice actually, but you can get people, you can even get people with a British accent to read books. I can see the value of it, and I also get that some people are auditory learners as opposed to visual learners or kinesthetic learners. And I happen to be a visual learner, which is why the book has lots of illustrations in it and charts and things like that. And visual imagery and experience of place and space are really important. So maybe the question is one that I should take back again and think about again as to whether an audiobook is doable.
Mm-hmm.
So I appreciate that.
Yeah, absolutely. Another question. How do you suggest, oops, just popped out. Here we are. How do you suggest that local partners, such as health departments, assist school districts that are underserved and feel that creating systemic change in reference to trauma is something that falls at the bottom of the list when they're working to address immediate issues like food insecurity, school receivership, deficits in budget with reference to supply and faculty, etc.? Question mark.
So I get that historically trauma has fallen to the bottom of the priority list. And if current events are any indicator, it should no longer be at the bottom, because it's an umbrella that describes all those other items that were discussed. Items like homelessness and food scarcity and domestic abuse and the like. So I think that the idea of it being, here's what it reminds me of. When we make a budget, people say, oh, it's just numbers. No, it isn't. It's values. It's what matters to us. And we represent it in numbers. But what a budget really is a statement of what we value. Well, that's true for organizations. How they spend their time and their money is a statement of what they value, what's important. And trauma, it seems to me, isn't at the bottom, it's at the top. And if you address it, everything else can fold into it. And we make a mistake, by the way, by thinking trauma is like some out there thing that happens to like some limited number of people. While trauma does affect low-income populations more, trauma is an equal opportunity offender. And so much like a virus, actually, it also can be caught. It can be caught in terms of secondary and vicarious trauma. So if we don't make it a priority, it's not going away. It's not going to get squelched at the bottom of the list there. So my suggestion is put it at the top.
Thank you, which again points to, I think, a policy solution, doesn't it, at some level?
So there have been some efforts to legislate. That's one way of getting at policy. Mandating various kinds of approaches to trauma, funding them within schools, funding diagnostic items, funding trainings. So law is one way to do it. In terms of policy, you need the policymakers to believe that it has value. And a really interesting thing happened at the policy level. I went to the first federal congressional hearing on trauma. And while they had experts there and some people who had been traumatized, what happened in that room was startling, because a number of the Congress people started talking about their own trauma. The opportunity once they, oh, wait, I've had that. Or wait, that's been part of my, I didn't even know there was a name for that. And so you have to educate policymakers about trauma, about the terminology, about what it is and its omnipresence. I will never forget the educator who said to me, trauma is a trend. It'll go away. Really? I don't think so.
Okay, that's true. And your book is a testament to not only that it will not go away, but about the power, the need to respond in a very comprehensive way. And Karen, your book helps bring us to a more complete understanding of what it is that we have to face, and then very helpfully how we might begin to address it. I don't see any other questions, so I think we can wrap up, Tina.
Okay, great. Thank you, everyone, for all of your super questions. We're going to be putting up a slide in a few minutes that has information about how to get in touch with Karen, and she'd really like to do a presentation on improving racial tensions within the educational institutions. So if that interests you, be sure to reach out in the chat and let us know, or you can email or get in touch with Karen. So I had put in the chat the winners of the first arrivals: Corey, Linda Reeves, Warren Green, Margie, Bob Bardwell, Natalie, Lara, Sandra Jordan, Lisa Sanz, and Jose Garrido. So congratulations. Please email Karen Gross Cooper at gmail.com with your, did I get it on there right? Yes, with your snail mail address, and she will pop her special gift into the mail for you. And our 3 book winners are Tatiana Harrison, Zach Cooper, and Ronald Peterson. So if you can do the same, email Karen and she'll get the book, a copy of the book in the mail to you. And I did see in the chat that Karen, your book is sold out on Amazon. And we know that it is in fact a bestseller in the education consulting category. And we also know that the books are en route in the warehouse waiting to be unpacked at Amazon. So definitely place your order and or let Karen know, and we'll figure out a way to get them to you if you can certainly TC Press, order them at TC Press as well. So I think I've done my part, and Karen, you can take it away. Oh, and KarenGrossEducation.com. Visit Karen on the website too. Go ahead, Karen, close us out.
So I just want to say thank you to the panel. I thought your answers were really thoughtful and they're deeply appreciated. And a special thank you to Brian for asking really good questions and moderating the panel. And to those who attended, my thanks. I thought your questions also were excellent. And I hope this has started a conversation. This isn't the last conversation. And I hope it's an indicator that there are many more remarkable conversations still to be had. And I look forward to having them with you. So thank you.
Nice.
Does anyone have any, I'm sorry, go ahead. I was going to ask if anyone has any last minute questions. Karen is happy to stick around. Otherwise, Brian, do you want to see if we have any last questions?
Taking a look. Someone said Amazon is taking orders, and I'm sure they are.
Great.
And someone asked, would love info on the next webinar.
So Brian and I have been talking about, and I've been talking to Dr. Ed Wang, who's at Mass General Hospital, and who specializes in trauma as it relates to communities, about doing a follow-on for the topic of the impact, the traumatic impact of racial discrimination and how it can be handled in our communities and in our schools, informed by the strategies in the book. And also, just so you know, that would be the topic of it. And in fact, you could call it the missing chapter from the book. And maybe it's the chapter that is useful to use where the principles of the book can be transported forward. But just so you know, Ed and I are also working on what we're calling the feeling alphabet, which is a way of helping both younger students and older students name the feelings that they're experiencing. But here's the key: the positive ones and the negative ones. And so it's really a set of activities that let you name the feelings you're having so that you can then progress to taming them. So that could be part of our conversation at a subsequent webinar, if there's sufficient interest for it.
Nice. And there's one other remark. Dr. Ken Hardy is also excellent for intergenerational transmission of racial trauma. And he's at Drexel University, and his recommendation to watch Dr. Hardy on YouTube. Okay.
I think that's, there are actually a number of people who are very thoughtful on this topic. And I think the webinar could include some remarkable panelists to discuss it. And one more thing, I just want to say TC Press has the ebook version of it discounted if you like ebooks. And also if you do a group event, there are discounts available that way too, to make the book more affordable, which is something I'm doing, actually teaching out of the book at several places. And we're doing it where there can be a group discount for the students. There also can be one for groups of teachers or educators or other people who are interested. So I just wanted you to know TC Press does that, and they deserve a lot of credit for making this all happen. So a thank you to them. I'm proud to be published by them.
Thank you, Karen. And we're very, very pleased to have you as our author.
Thank you.
I don't see any other questions. I think we can move to wrap it up for this one, but it's a conversation, as Karen remarks, is to be continued. So thank you, everybody.
Bye. Thank you.